We're here. This has been in the works for a while, so I'm really, really excited this morning to get us kicked off. And we are talking about lessons from uncontested races and what we can learn from around the world. And so when we started to think about putting together this event, it really became clear to us that the lack of candidates running for positions in local government was a fundamental problem, and it requires immediate and strategic attention. I am really excited for today's live conversation with BallotReady and NationBuilder on this often overlooked issue and what we can actually learn from those around the world. I am Saoirse, the head of marketing here at NationBuilder, and I'm excited to introduce our fantastic speakers. So up first, we have David Spearman, the Senior Director of Data and Strategy at BallotReady. David oversees data production, development, and data governance at BallotReady to ensure that users and partners have the information that they need to make informed decisions. We also have Jay Godfrey, the VP of Customer Success here at NationBuilder, political wonk and deep believer in advancing the cause of democracy and civic participation. At NationBuilder, Jay leads the teams that support the thousands of customers around the world trying to make change and build the future. So what are we actually going to cover today? This event is going to provide a detailed analysis of why so many races remain uncontested. We're going to be sharing global stories of successful democracies and offer some actionable steps your community can take to ensure that the 2024 election is competitive and representative. Now I'm going to pass it over to Jay to take you through a NationBuilder overview.
Thanks, Saoirse. At NationBuilder, we are a software company, but we are a mission-driven company, and it's baked into everything that we do. Our vision is a world where everyone has the freedom and opportunity to create what they are meant to create. And our mission is we build the infrastructure for a world of creators by helping leaders build and organize thriving communities. So our theory of change, what animates us is that solving today's challenges isn't about one leader. It's about millions, and NationBuilder exists to make it possible for anyone to easily mobilize their community and lead them to action. We talk about ourselves as leadership software, and that isn't just politics, but unavoidably, it intersects a lot with the political world because those are many of the folks who are most likely to think of themselves as leaders. So what do we do? How do we actually live that out? We provide the software that includes all the things that a leader needs to build and engage their community. That includes a dynamic people database, CRM tools, a hosted website that is optimized for different types of actions you would want a supporter of your movement to take, communication tools, think email and text, and fundraising and donation tools, including payment processing, because raising the money to power your movement is an important part of it. And then last, but certainly not least, via our newest product, Action Button, we also provide the tools for grassroots advocacy and contacting lawmakers. So our product is built with 4 principles in mind. The first is own your own data. And the idea here is that as a movement, your data really means your relationships with your supporters and your understanding of the history of that. It is the most important asset you will build, and it should always be yours. So we don't use our customers' data to update some big central database, and it is always theirs to take with them and use however they wish. Also important, putting people at the center. We try to help people prioritize the relationships with individual supporters, an understanding of that person's relationship to them, and engaging with them in a way that takes that into account. Move people to action, pretty self-explanatory. We want to create as many opportunities as possible for our customers to mobilize and activate the people who support them, and then distribute leadership. This is organizing. It's about sharing responsibility within your movement so that you can build and scale without losing the personal touch of direct relationships with supporters. And our impact is pretty enormous. 2023, not a major US election year, and nonetheless, a lot was going on. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we are not just a US company. We are genuinely global in the scale in which we operate and the organizations that we serve. So about that, we have team members on 4 different continents, and we work with customers in over 100 countries. In 2024 alone, we have customers involved in 29 different elections, which is really cool. It gives us the benefit of being able to see things with a bit of a different perspective than many folks who work with political organizations, and you'll hear me bring that to the discussion today. Back over to you, Sorsha.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was great. Okay, we are now going to hear from the wonderful David on all things ballot ready.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, I'm David. BallotReady got started in 2015 when we realized there was a real need to understand who's running for local office. We got started in Chicago when folks realized for the local city council elections that were happening, it was very difficult to find information and be informed and ready to vote. Since then, we've grown to cover elections nationwide, all the way down the ballot. We are on a mission to help people take civic action at all levels of government, and really be informed and empowered to participate in democracy. Next slide, please. As an organization, we provide 3 major tools for folks. The first is our Civic Center. Anybody can go to this at ballotready.org. This is a one-stop shop to make you prepared to get out and vote and take civic action. It covers everything from checking your voter registration, finding your voting options, researching all the candidates on your ballot, and even looking up your elected officials. We also provide these as white labeled products for other organizations. Outside of that, we offer a couple data products. One of them is bulk data, all of that information that powers our Civic Center, all the information on candidates and office holders, upcoming elections and races is available to folks as bulk data. And we also have an API that powers this data so people can build their own products on top of our data for whatever type of vision you have for a product. And this is our Civic Center, and this is what we're most well known for. As you can see here, there's all of the options on the bottom here that I discussed before. But we also are really focused on the upcoming elections for folks so they can research their entire ballot. But because we do all this research, one of the great things is we can dive into all the data and pull out some really interesting insights. So that's one of the main things we're going to talk about today, which is our uncontested races research. So let's dive into it. So we looked into all of our data on candidates running across the nation, and we found some really interesting and a little bit frightening trends in the data. So I already mentioned we cover candidates nationwide and on all levels of government. For the purpose of this research, we are looking at all federal, all state level, and all county level positions, regardless of population. We are also looking at city level positions in cities over 50,000 or cities within a county over 50,000. Similarly, we're covering townships and school board races in counties over 50,000. Counties over 50,000 make up about 88% of the US population. So we have a pretty wide scope of what we're looking at here. And our analysis is from election years 2020 to 2023. We'll definitely be excited to look at what we're seeing in 2024 after this. But the big takeaway that we've seen year after year is around 60 to 70% of races are uncontested each year in the November elections. And this is a pretty startling trend, especially when we think about how many positions are being elected. So when we break this down, one of the things I'm going to be talking about in detail is what the November 2022 trends look like. Like I said, we've covered multiple years, but want to dive into this November election specifically. So like I said, around 60 to 70% of races do go uncontested. Our definition of that is that there are equal or fewer number of candidates for the number of seats that will be filled. So for example, that could be one candidate for one congressional seat. It also could be, for example, 3 seats open on a school board, but only 2 people running. So the thing here is where a voter has no actual choice on who to vote for when they get to the ballot in November. But when we break this down, we see that it is not equal across the levels of government. For federal races for Congress, almost all of them are contested. I think people are pretty familiar with that. As we move down, state level races are even not that much contested. Some of this is driven really by judicial as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. But especially as we get more local, especially county level races are consistently uncontested in November elections. Next slide. So like I mentioned, one of the big things we see here are the justice system. These types of positions are just not contested. District attorney positions, district and circuit courts, pretty consistently only one candidate on the ballot, which means folks do not have a choice for who is in charge of their judicial systems locally. We also see some really interesting trends with population. Large population counties, while those county level positions still have a lot of uncontested races, it's more contested than as you move into more rural counties. And we'll see also some trends in partisanship when we get there. Another interesting thing to pull out is, not all races are run the same across the country. For example, California uses a blanket primary system where all candidates run together in the primary and the top 2 advance to the general, regardless of party. What that means is they almost always have contested races in November. However, it does mean that sometimes the voters only have one party to choose from when they get to the November ballot. So in 2022, we saw in California across federal and state races, 6 of those races had no Democratic candidate and 30 had no Republican candidate. In many of those, there were either 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, or 1 Democrat and 1 minor party or independent. And so I think with any type of voting system, there's some trade-offs. Maybe you do get fewer uncontested races, but it might mean that voters have fewer choices in terms of party candidates. Next slide, please. So speaking of parties, we wanted to see how these trends look among the 2 major parties. So as you can see here, there are huge differences between the candidates that are on the ballot between Democratic and Republican parties. And this gets even more intense as you move down the ballot. So federal races, there's a little bit of a difference, but especially if you look at county races, there are way more races with no Democratic candidate than races with no Republican candidate. We have not drawn causal inferences from this, but a few theories we have on why this happens is there are way more counties in the nation, and the way counties exist is, a lot of these states, when they came into existence, they just sliced up the state by rectangles or squares, didn't matter by population, and then state statutes say that each county needs to have, a sheriff and a board and a coroner and a treasurer. And so there are so many more positions in rural areas where the Republican Party has more control. That's, I think, one of the big drivers of this. But once again, we're not necessarily saying causal. It's just a couple of trends that we see. Next slide, please. Next thing we want to see are minor party and independent candidates filling those gaps where there are not Democratic or Republican candidates. And what we're seeing is there certainly are existing, they're in a lot of races, but they're mostly showing up in federal and state executive races where there already is a lot of competition. We're not seeing a ton of minor party and independent candidates in state legislative or county races, where we were just seeing before in the previous slides, where there are a lot of uncontested races. So one potential thing that we could see is more participation in minor party or independent candidates getting involved in these down ballot races where there aren't as many candidates. So the November election is already underway. A lot of states are already early voting, absentee voting. So those candidates are all set. But even as Jay said, odd years, there's a lot happening. There's a lot to do. In 2025, there will be over 100,000 people elected in the US across the nation. That is more seats than will be up this November. Most of these will be happening at the city level, school board, township level, where we just saw there's so many uncontested races. Some of these are happening as soon as February. Filing deadlines are just around the corner. So if we want to change this and have an impact, next year is ripe for opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. That was so helpful and illuminating. Sorry about the technical snafu, folks. Please, I know the chat is not working, and so drop questions you've got into the Q&A. And with that, I am going to flip it over to Jay to take us through what is happening outside of the US and some things that we can learn from that.
Yeah, that was a really amazing tee up of the scale and scope of the problem here. And David went heavy on data. I'm going to go a little heavier on anecdotal from things that we are seeing. At NationBuilder, we have the privilege of getting to see the work of democracy that happens around the globe. And I am really excited to talk about a couple of examples today that point at a possible way to start to move the needle on uncontested races. So I think high level, what's really critical in chipping away at the problem is identifying the right problems to solve in each community. And those problems will be different in each community. In doing that, it becomes more possible to attract the kinds of candidates who are committed to solving those problems in a way that resonates with voters, regardless of their partisan affiliation. A huge barrier to political participation, of course, is people feeling like they can't change the future. And people feel that way because they believe they are alone in caring about the things that they care about, or there isn't enough momentum behind them to make a difference. And most of the time, that's not as true as they think it is. So I want to talk about a really fascinating model in Australia, which is independent voice groups. I don't know if folks here are familiar with this. It's manifested at the electoral level as the wave of teal independence in Australian elections. But it starts with this phenomenon that has emerged kind of organically over the past decade. So I think important caveats here. What David said about electoral systems does matter. Australia has a different system than most places in the US because they have ranked choice voting. But nonetheless, the premise here, I think, is a viable one anywhere. And it is that a significant number of federal electorates in Australia, which is their equivalent of congressional districts, have been held for a long time by one single party or the other, often by incumbents who don't face serious opposition. And that understandably leads there to a sizable number of people feeling like they're not being represented. So that's not dissimilar to the challenge we have at the local level here. And what's unique is that the way they go about changing that actually doesn't start with a political party fielding a candidate in an electorate where they normally would say, we can't compete here. And it doesn't even start with a focus on finding a candidate at all. It actually starts with a small number of people, like sometimes literally 3 or 4 people getting together, identifying that they want to start to change the narrative about what's important in their community. And they organize a voice group and they conduct a listening tour in the community. They have a name for this that all of them use, which is kitchen table conversations. And the whole idea is literally having people organize conversations, often at their homes or at their businesses, where they just talk and listen to get an understanding of common themes to what's important to people in that community. The questions are things like, what's special about this place? What do you love about living here? But also, what are the biggest problems to solve in our community? So in doing that, they build their visibility in the community. They start recruiting volunteers to help with the work. They generally create the infrastructure for long-term viability. And once that listening tour is done, they report out on the results. Like they write a full-on report. They publish it for anyone to see. You go to any one of these groups' websites, and if they've been around long enough to have done it, there's a report there that you can download. You can learn a whole lot about what's going on in that community. And they decide whether they think the problems that they've identified are big enough that they require fielding a candidate. Sometimes the answer to that is no, and they just go back to focusing on working within the community. But if the answer is yes, they write a formal job description for the candidate who will represent them, and then they go looking for that person. It's an open nomination process. Like oftentimes they will literally have a form on their website for people to nominate someone, and they'll consider them. And as a general rule, the person they will decide on is likely not the first person to put their name forward. The right way to think of this for sure is a more grassroots version of candidate recruitment. And the whole idea is that this is not about people starting these groups as like stealth incubators for their own candidacy. So when they find the right person, that person runs. And if they win, they form what they call a two-way compact with the community. And there's a hard expectation baked into that they're reporting back to the community group and vice versa. The voice group is regularly sharing with them, okay, here is our updated analysis of what's important in the community based on ongoing kitchen table conversations. So that model has translated into pretty astonishing electoral success in 2019 and particularly 2022. Again, these folks tend to be labeled teal independents, but they currently hold 8 of 151 seats in the Australian Parliament, and the community groups that are the engine behind it are currently operating in at least 20% of Australian federal electorate. So this is already a sizable scope for what is still a very new concept. And it's a fascinating model. The whole idea is not to start a political party. It's not even necessarily to win an election. And it's much more about building cohesion and shared purposes in the communities. And when they have fielded candidates, those candidates have tended to be center leftish, like more liberal social policy goals, focus on climate change, some more economically conservative tendencies, but the ideological bent isn't really the point here. It's just an enormously compelling, innovative answer that's also kind of common sense to the question of how do you get people invested in politics in a way that expands the range of possible outcomes. So Australia is a great example of how that can happen organically within communities. But I do think there's also an opportunity for existing organizations to do the kind of ground up listening that can make different outcomes possible. And I want to talk about one in the United Kingdom, whose work we've gotten to see firsthand. That is the National Union of Students. These folks have a constituency, both students and apprentices, that represents about 10% of the voting population in the UK. So there's real potential energy. And they have very ambitious goals of increasing the percentage of those people who are active participants in their organization. Their goal is to get 1 million people involved. They are about halfway there at this point, which is pretty incredible. And they've pursued a lot of really practical nuts and bolts initiatives to make sure that those people are voting. Those are things like voter registration drives, simplifying the process for their student members to get valid IDs so that they can comply with the UK's new voter ID requirements. And they ended up reaching about 40% of UK students ahead of the 2024 elections, despite those elections coming about 3 months earlier than people expected. But to me, the most interesting thing is an initiative they pursued called What Students Think. This was a massive survey of students around the UK. They ended up getting over 10,000 responses, which for a really in-depth, time-consuming survey is a pretty awesome response rate. And they were looking for 2 kinds of information from folks. this is going to sound a lot like the community voices groups. Number one, what are students dealing with in their lives? So like, are you having to cut back on food to save money? How much are you having to work in addition to being a full-time student to support yourself? What's just the reality for these people? And second, what issue areas are highest priority for you and which ones aren't? This was not totally open-ended, but it was wide-ranging while still being intentionally focused on the specific needs and challenges of students. And once they had that information, they did the same thing the independent voices groups did. They published it. They published the raw results online, even when maybe those presented kind of a complicated policy picture, just totally transparent about it. And they synthesized it into a manifesto for our future ahead of the elections that they then circulated and publicized as widely as they could. And when they shared it, their whole frame, and I'm quoting this from their website, was the only thing worth our votes at the next general election is a vision for a decent future for people and planet with a credible plan to deliver it. So to politicians and parties looking for our votes, we say, this is our future. We're here for it. Are you? The thing I love about that is it manages in a really digestible way to simultaneously underscore, yeah, their constituency of students is not monolithic, but they have important shared priorities. It gets those students more invested in the political process and a shared identity. And it also essentially issues a challenge to candidates. They're not using this manifesto as a means to make political endorsements. They're actually saying, you can win our votes if you want them. Here's how you do it. And then it backs that up with hard data in a way that's totally transparent. They didn't go out and recruit candidates based on that in the way that the voice groups did. They certainly could have. And ultimately, what they effectively did was they created a job description again for the candidates that they wanted to represent them. That started with listening to their community and identifying the actual correct problems to focus on. And I think that, if I were to sum up what I take away from all of that, the opportunity for people and for groups who are staring at a whole lot of offices where incumbents are running unopposed over and over again is approach that problem in a different way. I think the right question to ask at the start is not who could win this seat, but it is actually what problems are not being adequately solved in our community. Like, do we not feel represented? And if so, how do we not feel represented? And then take that back to the community. Get the actual data and input to validate that it's real and to determine whether those problems are universal and compelling enough to be a good reason to drive change. If they are, then you'll come out of that clear on what the job description is for a candidate. And that will help you attract the right candidate who might not come from the traditional channels, but could be someone from the community who sees themselves in that. And even if you don't come out of it clear on that, you'll have built a foundation for continued political engagement and just better awareness in the community. But if you get the right candidate, they'll either win or they will push the incumbent in a way that will make them more responsive. Healthy opposition makes public servants better. And so the chance here is to create the circumstances in which healthy opposition is possible on a regular basis in communities where it previously wasn't. We have different electoral realities here in the US. We know that. But I think that's a universal principle, and it's one that could work here too.
I am going to stop my share and I'm going to bring David on to the stage. So now we are into a live conversation, right? We've just heard from both Jay and David on some really hard data here in the States, and also what we've seen around the globe in terms of how folks are tackling this problem in different continents. And so the first question that is coming to mind to me here, I think in particular, David, when I was reflecting back on the data set that you'd shared, when we are seeing the impact of minor parties and independents, and what we heard kind of from Jay there specifically in Australia, Do you think with the increased number of those minor parties or independents that are pooling together in the states that we're going to see a larger impact of those minor parties as we come into 24?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really excited to see that data once we have a complete picture for 2024. But I think there is a lot of desire to push the envelope on what we're seeing with just the two parties having a majority of the power in electoral politics. But I think also the reality is, our entire system is set up to support the two major parties. I mean, just thinking about the way primaries are run, how it the hurdles to get on the ballot, collecting signatures, paying filing fees. It's quite difficult for, I think, a minor party or independent candidate to prop up their own campaign with the way that we have the system set up. Versus having, a coordinated state campaign or county party that can help get a candidate prepared to gather all those signatures, do all the things they need to get on the ballot. And so that would be, I think, for me, a really interesting thing to look into or learn from candidates, especially these minor party and independent candidates. What are the hurdles that they've faced to get on the ballot, feel supported? We know that elections cost more and more money each year to run a race in. And so I think there are, while there's increased energy, there's also increased barriers to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay, anything you want to add on that?
I mean, I think the thing that really struck me in David's presentation, and it resonated a lot, was that so much of the energy is going towards races that are already hotly contested further up the ticket. And the question that raises for me, and I definitely have an opinion on it, is what's the opportunity for folks outside of the traditional structure of politics to get traction and make a real impact closer to the ground at the local level? I think congressional races, Senate races, gubernatorials, presidential, certainly, they suck up so much oxygen, but there is so much change that happens at the local level that impacts people's lives in a way more immediate and direct way, and it goes overlooked. So the thing that I'm interested to see is, does awareness of that and the desire to tackle that start to shift among non-traditional political organizations and folks outside of the two major parties split? Or does all that time and effort and money keep getting thrown at federal races and top of ticket state races?
Yeah. The other thing that I heard both of you speak about is the electoral system that we're presented with. And hearing, I think, David, specifically, you talked about the process in California. Jay, you talked about RCV that's taking place in Australia. And I know there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to bring change in the electoral process here in the States. Do you think that that will have we'll call it down ballot effect on these lower races if we are able to change in the US here some of the kind of technical infrastructure that goes into place to actually voting? And we'll open that up to both of you.
Yeah, I know I'm always going back to the data, but there are multiple ballot measures on the ballot this November about changing electoral systems in a variety of states. Some of these are about these blanket primaries, moving to a system where it's, a top 2 or a top 4 move on to the general, ranked choice voting in the general. So we are seeing a lot of movement and a lot of concentrated, organized effort. I mean, it takes so much energy, again, to get signatures, to get these measures on the ballot. But on the flip side, we're also seeing some state legislatures pass laws that forbid changes like ranked choice voting. And so I think there is a little bit of a battle going on about what sort of electoral systems we're going to have in this country. I think it's going to continue to play out. In addition to those, some other interesting ones I know happen at some local levels are where you can vote for as many of the candidates as you like. So say there's like 5 candidates for mayor. If you like 3 of them, you can actually vote for 3 of them. And it still is sort of who gets the most, but it's not just, vote for one. So I think there's a lot of interesting systems for us to consider and especially look at the impact for those communities.
I think the work folks are doing on that front is fascinating, and it feels like it's getting more sophisticated, more professional, like better resourced as time goes on. You see things like the congressional election in Alaska last cycle, where people are really starting to feel the impact of voting systems changing. And yeah, to your point, David, some people are excited about it. Some people aren't. The people who are on the losing end tend to want to like go back to the way it was before. The people who benefit tend to want to keep going with it, which that's politics. But a lot of that work is also, again, happening at the local level. Like there's a lot of cities where people are working to change how the elections work in that city. And I think that goes overlooked somewhat as reform of election systems gets a lot of publicity at the state level. I also think, there's a danger in ascribing too much just like electoral system is destiny vibe to local elections, because there's so much hard-coded partisanship at the federal level. It's hard to overcome just like partisan identification in like a US Senate race. The closer you get to the ground level, the more it's like people's personal impressions of a human and the impact that person has on their life or their character. For municipal offices, like you're often voting for someone you might know, or voting against someone because you know them and you're like, ooh, I don't know about this person. So I think there is sort of like this assumption that a lot of these uncontested offices are unwinnable because of partisan preferences that I don't buy. I don't buy, but it's the question is, how do you get started?
Yeah. How do you get started? And I want to come back to that for the candidate, but thinking from an organization's perspective, like I heard you talk, Jay, about in US, like what does it look like as a business, as a leader in the community to actually help your employees engage in a way in politics that isn't tied to this partisanship, that is just about participating in the electoral process? Like, can both of you speak to that? Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of ways, and it definitely depends on the nature of your organization and what you're comfortable with. You're right, Sorsha. Like the partisanship thing, I think, is the thing that scares people because they don't want to be seen, understandably, as engaging in partisan activity or trying to push a particular viewpoint on people. But I would hope that we can all agree that participation in the political process is a good thing. No matter who's doing it, it's a good thing. And I think, they're really simple things that people can do. Election day is not a national holiday here in the United States. Well, we give our employees in every country we have employees in the day off so that they can go and vote. That's the kind of thing that's like, it sounds obvious and simple, but it's really impactful. It sends the message to people that participating matters and that, yeah, whatever your view, you should have a stake in the outcome. I think also just encouraging folks to go out and participate, not even necessarily in a political way. Volunteer, do things in your community that make a difference. Everything ultimately boils down to what's the future you want to see for your community, and being more involved will make you more aware and more likely to participate in elections.
Yeah, I have to agree with that as well. I know, we do a lot of work around elections, but that is not the end all be all for making change in your community. There's so many ways to get involved with community groups, and we think a lot about just that education is power as well. And so one of the things we love about our tool is just allowing people to look up all your elected officials. I think we hear time after time, folks don't even know that they have so many people who represent them and frankly work for them. People know about the president, they know about Congress, but a lot of folks that we talk to have no idea that there are all of these local levels of government, especially things like, special districts that are in charge of things like your public utilities, hospitals, these public services that really impact your community. Knowing about all those levels of government and who represents you and just getting educated about that, I think is a really powerful way and a great way for other organizations and companies to participate in a way that doesn't feel partisan. It's just be informed, get educated.
Thank you both. I want to make sure that if folks in the audience have questions, you start to just get them into the Q&A box so I can line them up. And Jay, David, do y'all have questions of each other? Would love to give you some space.
David, I'm curious, as you were digging into the data, obviously it's all kind of eye-opening and shocking, but I feel like also at BallotReady, you all kind of live in this reality a lot more than the average person does. Was there anything that really just jumped out at you and shocked you, even relative to your own, maybe more realistic expectation about this than most people have?
Yeah, the two things that really stuck out to me were the differences in, two major party participation in the lower levels. But I actually think the one that stuck out the most was how uncontested our judicial system positions are. Like, it is so crucial. So many, things are decided by our court systems, people's individual lives, but also, the laws that stay on the books. And to see that, for a lot of these judicial positions, there's only one person. We know there are even more hurdles to participating. For a lot of these, you have to, have a law degree and have been a practicing lawyer for a long time. But it really seems to me like there's a huge opportunity there to seek out more participation among the judicial races. Especially the district attorneys who are deciding, what to prosecute and all that. It's that was really, really shocking to me. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I live in North Carolina now, but having lived in California for a while, those offices get so much attention in like big cities, big metro areas, but yeah, I feel like it's night and day when you move to, a mid-sized city or a small town. Like it doesn't get the spotlight on it. And I've got to think that's a contributing factor, along with the fact that, there are only certain people who are even eligible to run for those jobs because of professional qualifications.
Exactly. I have a question for you, which is I loved hearing about how y'all help people take actions. I'm curious what are the types of actions that you find resonate with like a typical person? Like what are the actions that you provide that people are really excited to do?
That is a great question. In a world where I feel like everyone's answer to that is donate, donate, donate. Yeah, of course, fundraising is important to any kind of movement. But the things that people seem to get the most fired up about are when they're being asked what they think. People like to tell you what they think. People like to share their opinion. Like we're human beings. We get excited about talking about things we're excited about. And so the kinds of things that we've seen get really good responses are things like quizzes and like giving folks the opportunity to give feedback and like share suggestions. And it's a cool means of like getting people's wheels turning. I think just being asked a question or like having the opportunity to share your perspective kind of gets you thinking like, what do I actually think? What do I actually care about? I think that's powerful. And it also makes people feel like you care. Like you do actually then, as a candidate or a movement, have to care. It is important. And I think like this theme of listening to folks is a big one for me, not by accident, but it's a way of getting people to feel invested because they don't feel like they're just being talked at. And being talked at is the killer. Everyone has people sending them emails. Everyone has people sending them texts. People who actually want to hear back will stand out.
Thank you. Thank you both. So interesting. And we've got some questions that have come in. So I do want to make sure that we get through some of those. So first up, we have from anonymous attendee, lets us know, I know you all mentioned the hurdles and specifically the financial hurdles in running campaigns. I'm curious how BallotReady and or NationBuilder have worked to combat those financial hurdles to make running for office more accessible. Yeah, David, Jay.
Yeah, I think for us, the biggest thing that we've done is partnering with candidate recruitment and candidate training organizations. We did a really amazing partnership a couple of years ago with Snapchat. We built a in-app experience for young folks to find offices that they're eligible to run for. But after they looked at that, the next step was connecting them up with a candidate recruitment or candidate supporting organization that matches some sort of demographic or ideological characteristic about them. And I think that, I mean, there are so many great organizations out there doing this work on the ground. And so what we want to do is support them by helping people find the offices they're eligible for and then connecting the people with those organizations.
A big thing for us is, we kind of coded into our mission and our operating philosophy as a belief that if you want to be able to compete in modern elections, technology tools are important to that. If you want to scale beyond a certain point, you need the mechanism to do that. So, we very deliberately make our software accessible at a really low price point for folks who are running smaller scale races. And the whole idea is that you can get booted up and you have the tools you need immediately to do a couple of things. Number one, raise money. Number two, be able to communicate with your initial supporters and enroll those folks as volunteer leaders, folks who will help grow your movement. Number three, get a website live that makes it easy for you to bring new folks into your orbit. Our goal is for people not to have to spend valuable time and resources bringing in professional staff before they have to when they're running those smaller campaigns, and be able to do more things that incorporate volunteers at a financial starting point that feels realistic for ordinary people.
Absolutely. The only other thing I would add on the NationBuilder side is a program that we launched back in 2016, which is runforoffice.org. And this gives you a database of offices that you would potentially be eligible to run for. We also have a full and free course that takes you from kind of inception of your campaign, finding your kitchen cabinet, to actually voter identification, GOTV, and what the beats are alongside that, paired with what Jay just described within the technology. Okay, it is 11:50, so I've got one more question that I'll ask, and then we'll do some closing statements. So this one is a little maybe pessimistic, but I want to hear the good spin. So if there are so many uncontested races out there in the world, why should I bother going to the polls?
My quick answer is those 30 to 40% of contested races, it's so important to have your voice heard. For me, though, some of the most exciting reasons to vote are the other things on the ballot. I know I already mentioned ballot measures, but it's a direct question to you about what you want in terms of policy. I think we just heard Jay talk about this as well. Like, people want to make their voice heard on issues that matter to them. ballot measures are a direct way to do that and say, I like this or I don't like this. You're not depending on a candidate or an elected official or a party to get things done. It is your opportunity to make your voice heard on a specific issue. So I think probably almost everybody has one of those on the ballot this November. Look for those, do your research, and vote on ballot measures.
Amen to that. And I want to underscore the do your research part of it. It's a non-trivial amount of work to really learn about and form an opinion about, all the different candidates who are running on the ballot, who might not be blitzing you with ads every day, and to learn about ballot measures in particular. But there is a phenomenon that is really important to understand, which is the language of ballot measures matters a lot. And sometimes it's going to be really straightforward. And sometimes it's not going to give you a clear picture of the impact of the thing. So make sure make sure you understand what the impact of the things you're voting for is. And if you're not voting, people are going to be voting, and those people might have interests that align with yours. They might not. You don't want to have your voice be unheard on election day, even if there's a whole host of offices that you don't have a real choice in. There's always something that matters on the ballot.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for attending. David, give us your closing thoughts, and Jay.
Yeah, my closing thoughts are, there is so much more going on in this country than just presidential or Congress. I mean, just purely by the numbers, the number of people who are elected at the county, city, local level, it pales in comparison. And so if you're feeling fed up with national politics, there is so much room for you to make your voice heard, participate, get involved, go to a city council meeting. There's just a wealth of opportunity waiting for you. That's more than the national level.
Amen to that. And I think the thing that I would say to people who are looking around and saying, how do I change this? How do I even start to move the needle in my community, is expand your definition of leadership. You don't have to be the person who runs for the office, but you can play a part in creating the conditions that make it possible for the right person to run. So I think the question to ask yourself is, what can my contribution be to starting to create a more engaged community where folks care and folks invest in the political process? And every single person has an answer to that question if they look hard enough for it.
Yes. Oh, thank you both. This has been such a fantastic conversation. And yeah, go vote, go and participate and build some bottom-up democracy. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. For more content like this, like and subscribe below. If you are interested in building the future with NationBuilder, check the link down below, and thank you so much for watching.